So, guys, today I will be doing my presentation on the real estate process. I'm going to try and keep this more oriented towards the business aspect of buying real estate and selling, but a lot of it also has to do with just being a homeowner, just as a person. So I'm going to get right into it. Why people buy property? You hear a lot of people say stuff like you have to buy land, you have to do that to be successful or to really get a surefire investment. And the first thing I want to start off this presentation with is just actually something I learned myself working for Amazon. So when I worked for Amazon it was last year, so I think it was 2021, if not 2020. Regardless, it was a new plant that had just opened up on the west side of my town in Tucson, Arizona, in a fairly populated area with a few decent houses around it. Long story short, within a week or two or months, there's probably 1,000 Amazon vans coming in and out of this huge warehouse and dispatch area right next to all these houses, which now these houses have to deal with an insane amount of local traffic around their houses. And frankly, there's not a single day they'll get off anytime in the future without having their streets just constantly being driven by Amazon employees and big vans. So, things like having your dog outside or little kids or anything like that is therefore a bigger risk. And frankly, I don't think anybody likes the idea of having hundreds and hundreds of vans just driving by your house all the time. So the reason I say this is that is one of the few times I have myself witnessed a property value go down. I mean, I am assuming that, but there's no way that the value of the property goes up from a huge Amazon plant being planted literally across the street. So that's just, I wanted to start off with something that I learned myself about real estate that I thought was useful, because usually people think when you buy real estate, it's almost it is 100% surefire, good idea. It's always going to go up in value when that's not the case. Another thing that I'll get into, one of my slides will cover this, but there's a lot of expenses that come with property as well. But anyway, why buy property? It's a necessity for any business. When I say any, that's not quite true, but most businesses do need a storefront or at least somewhere where they can have like a headquarter or anything, even just a shipping area. Whatever it is, you need to run an extremely successful business more times than not, you need some sort of property. So you'll have to buy or rent, which I'll get into the pros and cons of either of those soon. And like I was saying, I kind of mentioned like one rare time the opposite, but likely it will appreciate over time if you do buy a property. I'd say 9 times out of 10, I might be wrong, but in my opinion, 9 times out of 10, when you buy a property, over time, it will end up appreciating as opposed to depreciating. It's an asset. Mortgage is something that I wanted to bring up because it's different than like a car in a lot of senses. A car is a liability, but the reason why I think it's different because you have the option to mortgage is, let's say you are doing really bad and you've bought this property, you can mortgage it and then essentially take money that you paid on that house out that you will then owe again, and maybe it'll be at an interest rate where the lender makes a small profit of interest off you for doing that, but it's still something that's very valuable when you own a property as opposed to renting it. And just a nice asset to have as a business at all if a disaster does strike. And then very simply, it's an asset, not a liability. An asset, it will appreciate more times than not. Property will keep going up. A liability, such as a car, will just decrease right when it steps off the lot. So, all right. Next will be the advantages to renting as opposed to owning. It's kind of contradicting what I'm saying in terms of you should probably buy as opposed to sell, but I do want to cover some of these. Limited financial obligation. This is big. This means usually, I know at least with apartments from my experience, but a lot of times they'll make you pay a little bit up front, for example, like maybe 3 months rent, and then you start paying month to month. So that way, like maybe you do have to stop paying out of nowhere. You can't really leave on super short notice for the homeowner. But regardless, you can leave. That's what renting is. Whether it's a year lease you get into, month to month, whatever it is. I mean, you do have the option to leave at some point. You're renting it, not buying. Limited maintenance expense. This is actually a big one. This is something that isn't just maintenance. This is like there's a lot of things. I can tell you one example I know as just somebody that's lived away from home for about 5 years now. Is I've lived in apartments where we had to pay every bill as as roommates, and I've lived in apartments where it was like kind of handled by the complex. For example, like electric and water being covered by the complex. This was my student housing my first year at Fullerton, and that was extremely convenient, and like it was great. It was great. It's way easier. It's less fighting, all that. It's just caused a lot less problems when you don't have to worry about that. And then the other two will be there's more liquidity and more mobility when you rent as opposed to own. So maybe you do want to move, whatever it is. When you rent as opposed to own, you have more flexibility with those two things. The disadvantages of renting, and this is big, no equity growth or store value. Essentially, you'll have nothing to show for all the money you pay over time. If you rent for 40 years, you probably could have bought that same property for, similar price, if not less. Who knows? I mean, every property is different, but what I'm trying to say is you'll be left with nothing after. Although there are short-term advantages, the long-term advantages of having equity grow and having some sort of value stored is big. Renting lifestyle limitations, for example, no pets or no smoking. This is big. This is stuff where it's technically not your place. You're just renting it for a little bit. So, yeah, if the homeowner or business or whatever the case may be that owns this property, they can say stuff like no smoking or no pets, no extra tenants in there, whatever it is. These are things you don't have to deal with when you own the place yourself. Decorating or renovating, also a limitation. Like I said, the owner really controls all of that. And a less predictable housing expense. This, in my opinion, this means kind of like, rent can increase on you. Utilities can sometimes be more. When you own the house or when you have a set price that you've already agreed to buying, you don't have to, you can predict exactly how much you're going to be paying month to month. If not in total, you'll know a lot better. Advantages to owning as opposed to renting. Store value and possible equity growth. I've kind of covered this in a lot of different ways, but basically when you own property, more times than not, that property is rising in value, and that's a huge asset to have. Lifestyle choices, you could renovate, you could have pets, and you can do whatever you want. It's your place. Kind of goes into the third tab as well. Pride of ownership. It's kind of a big one because a lot of people say the American dream is owning your own house. Working hard and buying your own house here in America. I don't know where the term comes from, the American dream, but it's widely regarded as that. And like we kind of touched on, it's more predictable housing expenses, so you kind of know what to expect. Long and short term when you do own. When you own. The disadvantages of owning is the lack of liquidity and mobility, and significant annual expenses, which is a huge one I do want to get into, which is just there's several taxes, whether that's residence tax, whether it's sales tax, whatever it is, there's plenty of taxes and other hidden fees and expenses that I have not had to go through, being that I'm not a homeowner. But I do know when you purchase a house, there's an incredible amount of taxes and also rules. So like if you wanted to maybe flip your house, buy it for $100K and sell it for $200K, usually, depending on the state, there's rules for that. So I've heard of one, I don't know the exact specifics, but it was something like you had to live in that place for a year or two before you resold it, which is, it's just one of the rules that like you have to follow when you're owning or planning to sell a property, real estate. And the substantial financial obligation, that's big. I mean, when you buy a house, that's the biggest thing I think money can buy in a regular person's life. So when you commit to buying a house, maybe it is a little bit out of your price budget, and you're expecting to come into some capital or some money another way, and that doesn't end up working out, it could leave you in a really bad spot. Another thing that they don't really show here that I know through these business courses is, for example, limited liability. It's literally limiting your liability, so you don't have to worry about this. But when you have a corporation, and let's say somebody were to sue you, and you did own a property, they can come for you, and if you don't have enough capital, then they can't come for the property. So that would be a disadvantage to owning as opposed to renting, because if you rent it, then they cannot take that from you. Which I kind of goes more into the legal aspect of business, but I still think it's important when talking about real estate. So that's basically all I got. All in all, I think real estate in just being a regular person is a huge deal, but also in business. I can also think the last thing I'm going to close it with is just my mother's store, actually, in Tucson. It's a local store called Mast. Antiques and jewelry and stuff like that. Mast used to be in a place in Tucson. I know you won't be familiar with the terms, but it's called the Lost Barrio. And that was a cool little funky spot on the west side of town, which is cool. A very big place for a decent amount of money, like cheap amount. Long story short, she ended up switching and going into a smaller space that costed a lot more, that generated a lot more naturally, like people walking in. I forget what the word is for that, but it's basically like in a chain full of stores now, in a really cool little area where people will just always walk in and naturally just be walking that place or visiting or getting food there, and then checking her store out and potentially buying, and potentially she can make more profit even though she's paying more, which is something that she was definitely limited with her first place, being that it was kind of on the outskirts of the city. You wouldn't have naturally just ended up there. But yeah, that concludes my presentation. I want to say thank you for a good class, and I know it's an 8-week accelerated one, so I know it's been tough on your end, probably just as much as mine. But regardless, I'm appreciative to have you as a teacher, Mr. Aragon, and this has been a good class. Signing out, Luca Gelb.